A very, very good morning. I am Madhu Kumar Reddy. I, along with my friends here, we welcome you, all the participants, to this inaugural webinar of Anek Dhara. Firstly, I would like to share a little bit about Anek Dhara with you. Anek Dhara is an evolving public policy portal. Precisely, it is a platform we wish to create for open discussions on public policy and also on to create more space for discussing issues and developments which impact life in our country and in the global context too. So, to this end, we hope to host a seminar on the last Sunday of each month, and on all these topics which are evocative and are relevant and are contemporary, which and of public interest. So that's in a nutshell about Anek Dhara. We also have a website to learn more about us. Please go to anekdhara.in. And those of you who are interested in joining our mailing list, please send your details to our Gmail ID called anekdhara@gmail.com. Now, moving on to today's theme of the webinar today and why we chose it. For today's webinar, the theme is Jawaharlal Nehru's life and legacy, critical perspectives. We are at now about 132 years after the 132nd birth anniversary, 2 weeks after that. At a stage like this, how does one evaluate a leader some 6 decades after he is gone? So that would be the theme. And here to evaluate somebody, let's say some 6 decades after he is gone, I have a Hegelian quote here, a quote which E.H. Carr in What is History calls, I quote, "The great man of the age is the one who can put into words the will of his age, tell his age what its will is, and accomplish it. What he does is the heart and essence of his age. He actualizes his age." How does Jawaharlal Nehru measure against this benchmark of greatness, or for that matter, any other definition of greatness, any other progressive definition of greatness? Until some years ago, his name evoked awe and admiration, and most of the people would have acknowledged his vision, the greatness of his vision, and his enduring legacy. Today, however, we hear some questions which are divergent, which are discordant, and some may even be derisive. So these questions include, did Jawaharlal Nehru leave behind a lasting contribution to public policy? What is the imprint he has left behind which is still surviving? And has the Nehruvian component in our public policy diminished? And Nehru, did he, while acting in India's interest, as he straddled the ideal and the prudential, did he ensure that India's interest was protected, or did he falter while engaging with the realpolitik? These and similar questions are now, it is very common to hear these. So what we gather from all this is that even as we approach the 75th year of independence, there's a renewed interest in Jawaharlal Nehru and the role he performed as the first Prime Minister of India and what has been its impact. So hence the theme, and we would think that this is a good start for us. We have two reputed academics to discuss this theme today. One, Dr. Ananya Vajpayee, a fellow of the Center of Developing Society, Study of Developing Societies, and Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, Chancellor, Ashoka University. We have these two reputed academics. More about them, my friends will introduce them. After the two speakers finish their address, we have a question and answer session. So, as the webinar progresses, I would request all the participants to post their questions on the YouTube chat box. The questions will be taken up after both the speakers conclude their address. So, as you post the questions, please also give a short introduction of yourself, and so that we could take up those questions, we know whom we are replying to and addressing the responses to. So that's all. We'll get on with this now. I'll now request my friend Ravi Babu to introduce Dr. Ananya Vajpayee of the Center for the Study of Developing Societies and the topic we will dwell upon. Thank you. Over to you, Ravi.
Thanks, Madhu. It's my proud privilege to introduce Dr. Ananya Vajpayee. She is a fellow and associate professor at the Center for Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi. She works at the intersection of intellectual history, political theory, critical philology. Her first book, Righteous Republic, The Political Foundations of Modern India, appeared in 2012 from Harvard University Press. In the book, she discusses extensively about Jawaharlal Nehru and the struggle between idealism and realism. She is currently working on a political biography of Sanskrit. Ananya's long-term project is to write an intellectual life of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. She co-edited a fresh script for Ashish Nandi, A Life in Dissent, OUP 2018, and a volume titled Minorities and Populism, Critical Perspectives from South Asia and Europe, Springer 2020. She writes regularly about politics, arts, and ideas in the Indian and international press. We at Anekdhara are thankful to her for accepting our invitation to speak in this webinar on Jawaharlal Nehru, Visions and Myths. Please welcome Dr. Ananya Vajpayee. Over to you, madam.
Thank you so much, Madhu, Gagarin, Ravi Babu, Sadiq, and Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee. Thank you to Anekdhara. I really feel very, very privileged to be, in a sense, inaugurating your series of reflections on issues of vital public importance in the country and in the world today. It's very kind of you to invite me, and I'm delighted that we have a chance to think together about Jawaharlal Nehru, whose birth anniversary was earlier this month. And this also happens to be the month when, in 1949, the Constituent Assembly finally concluded its efforts and completed the drafting of the Constitution, which was then promulgated in January 1950. So this is an important and auspicious month, and this is an appropriate topic, I feel, for us to deliberate on while we can be virtually in a common space. There's so much to be said about Nehru, historically, as well as in terms of ideas, as well as in terms of our current situation. Now, I think many of us would feel attracted to or feel even compelled to the idea of this kind of discussion among members of civil society, among citizens, among thoughtful Indians today, for a particular reason, which is that we see a sort of alarming decline in the quality of our public life, and we see India really spiraling out of a rather optimistic position towards various kinds of crises and disintegration. Whether you look at indices that measure poverty, that measure pollution, that measure population demographics, whether you look at our collapsing relationships abroad, whether you look at the disintegrating social fabric, whether you look at the state of the minorities, whether you look at the situation in which our leading institutions find ourselves. And I say this across find themselves, and I say this across sectors, from higher education to the press and the judiciary, to the army, to the bureaucracy, to the public sector. There appears to be a crisis and an escalating decline in all of these aspects of our social, political, cultural, economic life. And at this time, I mean, definitely some of it is caused by the pandemic and by the global crisis, in terms of climate change, as well as COVID. But there seems to be some of this, which requires historical reflection, and which is peculiar to the trajectory that our country has taken over the last 72 odd years of independence. 75 years coming up now. I think there is a tendency to apportion blame. Why is this happening? It's happening because wrong steps were taken at the very beginning, because we went down the wrong path for a number of decades before some kind of course correction, because so and so failed in their historical role, early on, and that's why we find ourselves where we are today. This is the kind of discourse that we see rampant all around us. One is, of course, compelled to think about Jawaharlal Nehru because he was the figure who dominated the early years after independence, and the foundation and formation of the Indian independent nation state, and putting into place all of the architecture of the republic, for better or for worse. He's really he was the prime minister. He was also the most important political leader of the largest political party at that time. And so, in a sense, all praise and blame is easily directed towards him. But, I've taken the topic of visions and myths, and I want to look at the visions that Nehru himself had for both the future of India, as well as his vision of history and his vision of the past, but also the myths about him, the kind of outsized role that we attribute to him, which also kind of heightens the degree to which we praise him, or we defend him, or we blame him and attack him for all that is going wrong so long after his death, so long after the time when he presided over our public life, in a sense, and dominated our public life. I was just going over some of Nehru's writings, and in preparation for this meeting, and one of the things that struck me, which I hadn't thought about quite like that before, was that first of all, Nehru, of course, spent something like 10 years altogether in jail. And he used this time to read and write. And he wrote extensively and he read widely. We all know this. But it's interesting that a lot of what he wrote in jail, or from from these periods of being sequestered away from active politics and public life, was some kind or other of history. And you can see this in his autobiography, which was published first in 1936. You can see this in The Discovery of India, which came out just on the eve of independence. And you can see this also in his letters to his daughter, Glimpses of World History. So if you just take these three books, which are really his best-selling books even today, all of them beautifully written and imaginatively and with great literary flourish, sort of conceived, despite the circumstances in which many of these writings were composed. You see that in the autobiography, he is taking a look at his own life, his own past, his own journey, and that of his family and his close political and personal associates, up to a certain point when he publishes this in the mid late 1930s. In Glimpses of World History, which are his letters to Indira, he is looking at the history of the entire world and of civilizations, and taking a very, very global perspective on the past. And the discovery of India is, of course, about the history of India and the past as he sees it, in as much as it leads up to the present. So there is a strong historical consciousness at work. And I would like to make a comparison here with, and a difference as well with Mahatma Gandhi. I've written extensively about how I read Gandhi's Swaraj as an exploration of selfhood. It's after all self-rule that Swaraj sort of encapsulates. That Gandhi engages with the self at many different levels, as the individual self, as the community, as the religious group, as the national group, and as humankind. So there are these kind of concentric circles of selfhood, and he is concerned with Swaraj, sovereignty, freedom, in all of its meanings, on all these different levels of the self. Nehru, I would say, is concerned with the other. And why do I say this? And also at all different levels. Because when he's looking at history, he is really looking at a time that is far from our own, a time that is past, right? And in which we don't know many things, we don't understand many things, we may not identify with many things. There is an otherness to the past. There is an unknown quality to the past. But he's trying to understand this through his readings of Indian history, the readings and writings around different communities, different cultures, different parts of the world, different civilizations, different time periods from the deep past to the very recent past. And even when he's talking about himself in his autobiography, there is a way in which he objectively tries to look at himself as a young student, as a wealthy young man, as a somewhat lackadaisical young lawyer, as a member of the elite classes. So that he kind of stands at a distance even from himself. And in this sense, just as Gandhi engages with the self at all levels, I think Nehru tries to engage with the other at all levels, and we can see this reflected in his deep and consistent and lifelong interest in the past. We can also see this, Nehru's sort of outward looking vision in his perpetual, from a very young age right to the last minute of his life, engagement with the world at large. He is involved in democratic movements of decolonization, third world solidarity, sort of Cold War, post-Cold War non-aligned politics, the building of the UN, the building of the Commonwealth, the building of the non-aligned movement, trying to consolidate and group recently decolonized nations of the third world under a common banner, looking at the spread of democracy all over the world. He's interested in left-wing movements, which are also sweeping across the world in the early and middle of the 20th century. So the man is constantly engaging with the world beyond the borders of the British Empire or beyond the borders of independent India. And this very kind of active, vital, interventionist, and critical role that he plays on an international stage, I think is something that we sorely miss in the kind of positions that India today takes, both in its regional neighborhood as well as in the developing world, in the global south, and in the democratic world on a larger scale. I think we have at some point fallen away from the kind of historic role that Nehru envisioned, and to some extent he tried to build for India, even after coming out of a long period of being colonized, great poverty, all kinds of obstructions to growth, and to self-reliance. He nevertheless did not restrain himself from imagining a big role for India, whether it was moral, or it was political, or it was intellectual or cultural, the world over. So in that sense also, he was always reaching out to and engaging with others, just as Gandhi was always looking deep within and engaging with the self through Swaraj. So I see Nehru's historical proclivities, as well as his strengths as a diplomat, in his interest in foreign relations, international relations, in diplomacy, and in the democratization and decolonization of the world as such. I see that very much as his constant attempt to engage with others, whether in terms of countries, or in terms of ideologies, or in terms of distant parts of the world as such. Now, I just I think I'm running out of time, but I want to say that it's for historians, at least, it's not a question of praise and blame. I mean, praise and blame is something that does happen in public debate, and in as much as we are all citizens, as much as the next person, we may think in those terms, but historical evaluations are not made like that, and you have to take the big picture or when thinking about a figure who looms very large, like Nehru. And I think a lot has been said about, I would say, his three primary mistakes. And of course, in such a long political career, in all kinds of circumstances, people are going to make mistakes. But his biggest ones, I think, most prominent ones, may have been that he was unable in any way to prevent partition, or to manage the transfer of power in a way that might have involved less bloodshed, less loss of life, and less acrimony between the two new nations of India and Pakistan. And in that sense, I mean, he was not solely responsible for partition, but in as much as he had an outsized role to play, some of the questioning can certainly be directed towards the way in which he handled things in that very last phase, 1946-47, leading up to independence and partition. The second problem, I think, with which leaves a cloud over many of Nehru's considerable achievements, was his relationship with Sheikh Abdullah, and as a result of which he mishandled the question of Kashmir, neither accessing it into the Indian Union, nor allowing it to determine a separate path and an independent future for itself. The way he treated his friend and turned foe turned, subordinate Sheikh Abdullah in this sense is something that remains a deep wound in our national psyche, and indeed a festering problem that has yet to be solved in our history, in our politics. And finally, of course, towards the end of his life, people never stop blaming him for trusting the Chinese when perhaps it should have been clear to him that their intentions were not entirely benign as far as their territorial boundaries with India and questions of military power, and this, of course, in a sense, resulted in the disaster of the '62 war, whose ramifications are also still with us. So these three things, I think, should be up for discussion, and should be deeply engaged with by everybody. But we cannot forget at any moment that the public education system, the public transport system, our entire agricultural sector, all of the kind of rudiments of the state, from the constitution to the courts, to the electoral kind of cycles, to the organization of the states, to our perspectives on inclusion, on opportunity, on equity, on diversity, on pluralism, on freedoms and rights. All of this, both Nehru and Ambedkar, of course, through his pioneering role in constitution making, and Gandhi prior to that, prior to his assassination, in politicizing and mobilizing India at all, all of them played the role of building brick by brick this edifice, which is now collapsing all around us. And so it becomes very, very important. I think we wouldn't be, we wouldn't have anything to mourn the loss of if Nehru hadn't, put so much of this architecture in place. And I just want to close by saying that I've had occasion, to look a lot at comparatively at Turkey and India in recent years, and I'm always struck by the apparent comparison that can be made, the evident commonalities between Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the sort of founder of modern Turkey, of the Turkish Republic, and Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India. And of course, the most obvious thing that comes to mind is that both were committed to secularism. But the secularism intended in the two cases and practiced has entirely different meanings and forms, and ways in which that secularism played out in these respective societies. But what is so interesting is that even though currently Turkey does not have a leadership of any of the secular parties, nonetheless, all parties, including the opposition, are equally happy to claim Ataturk as a founder, as the father of the Turkish nation. And this is regardless of their nearness or distance to his secular credentials. Whereas in India, I think we are seeing a massive disavowal of Nehru by the right. A massive feeling of self-doubt in the left, and a kind of abandoning of the Nehruvian legacy by the center. And this means that really there are no takers for the Nehruvian vision. And why is this? And is this justified? And is this something which is sustainable? if India is to at all continue on its democratic path. This is something worth thinking about, and I'd like to leave you with that question. Thank you.
So thank you, Ananya. It's a very nice, nuanced exposition on Nehru and his role. So now we'll go to the next speaker, Professor Rudranshu Mukherjee. I request Gagarin to introduce Professor Rudranshu Mukherjee.
Thanks a lot, Ravi. And I have to start thanking the professor. Professor Rudranshu Mukherjee is the Chancellor and Professor of History at Ashoka University, of which he was also the founding Vice Chancellor. He studied history as an undergraduate at Presidency College, Calcutta, and completed his MA in history from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. He went up as an INLAC scholar to St. Edmund Hall, Oxford, and was awarded a DPhil in modern history by the University of Oxford. He was reader in the history department of Calcutta University. He held visiting appointment at Princeton University, Manchester University, and University of California, Santa Cruz. He was also the editor of the editorial pages, The Telegraph. He has written 5 books on the revolt of 1857, of which the most notable is Awadh in Revolt, a story of popular resistance. And a 6th book is A Begum and a Rani, Hazrat Mahal and Lakshmi Bai in 1857. It was published in July 2021. And he has got his last 3 books, we have to say recently. And the first one of the 3 is Nehru and Bose, Parallel Lives. Very interesting. It was then the second book is Twilight Falls on Liberalism and Nehru, a short introduction. And the third book, that is the most recent book, published in September 2021, is Tagore and Gandhi, Walking Alone, Walking Together. So obviously, we could not have found out a better speaker on Pandit Nehru. Over to you, sir. Professor.
Thank you. Like my friend Ananya, I am also deeply privileged to be part of this inaugural session. There inevitably will be some overlaps between what Ananya just spoke about and what I have to say, because we are largely dealing with the same themes and of course with the same individual. I want to look at Nehru's life and legacy in terms of certain phases of his life. They are interconnected, but for the reasons of analysis, it might be convenient to divide them into phases. One we can pass over very quickly, that is Nehru as a very young man. We know he was born into privilege. He was not educated in India. His father sent him to Harrow, then he went to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he got a tripos degree in the natural sciences and at the same time qualified as a barrister at law. He returns to India in his early 20s in 1912, presumably with the intention of taking up or sharing his father's flourishing legal practice. In terms of social attitudes at this time, he himself describes that he had all the attitudes of a westernized upper class prig. These words are Nehru's own, quoting from a phrase he uses to describe himself in the autobiography. The more important phase of Nehru's life, this is where his radicalization through baptism in politics begins. This is in the aftermath of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in April 1919. Nehru inadvertently, at the request of Chittaranjan Das, is a goes with the Congress committee to look into what had happened in Punjab during Jallianwala Bagh and in the aftermath of Jallianwala Bagh. And he sees for himself firsthand what actually had taken place, what the people of Punjab had to undergo, the sufferings. And he comes back with the clear idea that India is being ruled by a barbaric regime. British rule is nothing but a barbaric regime. And this is what starts his involvement with Indian nationalism. And this is catalyzed, of course, by Gandhi's call for the non-cooperation movement, into which Nehru jumps. And here we have another phase of radicalization. In the course of the non-cooperation movement, while he is in Allahabad, he gets to meet a group of peasants who had come to Allahabad from the southeastern districts of Uttar Pradesh, Raebareli, Pratapgarh, Sultanpur, Faizabad, areas like that. And they ask him, they actually came to Allahabad to meet Gandhi. Nehru went to see them. And they requested Nehru, said, we don't want anything from you, but just come with us to our villages and see for yourselves the wretched lives in which we live. And Nehru fixes up an appointment, and on a given day, he goes into these villages. This is his first exposure, a rich man's son's first exposure to the realities of India, to the poverty of India in the villages, deep interior villages of Uttar Pradesh. And he wrote about this experience and this exposure at great length in his autobiography, calling the chapters Wanderings Among the Kisans. It is while through this experience, that Nehru, as I said, he becomes aware of the conditions of the ordinary people of India. And two, also, he sees nonviolence in action, how these people are protesting against their conditions, the oppressions that they face through nonviolent means. And this merges together with Gandhi's message of ahimsa, the mobilization through ahimsa, and Nehru's exposure to ground realities in India. This has a profound impact of Nehru. And as I said, it has such a profound impact on Nehru that he writes about it at great length as one of his most formative experiences in his autobiography, about which Ananya spoke so eloquently. The next kind of phase in Nehru's life follows in the wake of the non-cooperation movement, when, for personal reasons relating to the health of his wife, he has to travel to Europe. And he gets to meet many radical intellectuals, writers, while he is traveling in Europe. And he comes to the conclusion, by interacting with these people, that India's struggle for independence against a barbaric regime is not an isolated episode that is happening only in India. This has interconnections and should have interconnections with what is happening in other colonized countries of Asia and Africa. So Nehru comes back to India in 1927 with two convictions. One is the Indian national movement being part of an international phenomena, political development, and the second, that India should in no way compromise with the various concessions and carrots that the British government are holding out to Indians. They should only put one item at the top of their agenda, that is complete independence. And this makes Nehru move, as the president of the Indian National Congress in the Lahore session of 1929, makes Nehru move what has come to be known as the Purna Swaraj resolution. And thenceforward, Congress was committed to complete independence and not to dominion status or any other kind of compromises that the British were willing to make with various sections of the Indian people. The next phase is again related to Nehru's exposure to Europe. And again, he has to travel to Europe because of his wife Kamala's illness, her last illness as it so transpired. This was a different Europe he was visiting. This was a Europe that was being threatened by unemployment, social discontent, following the Wall Street crash of 1929, spiraling inflation. And to combat this situation in Europe, two forces had emerged, two contending forces had emerged. One was fascism, which believed that all this discontent that was surfacing in Europe could be easily suppressed through military discipline. And to enable various parts of Europe to overcome this, it was necessary to overthrow liberties and democratic principles that had gained ground in Europe since the big end of the First World War. That was one force. The other force was coming from the example of the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution, that is the idea of socialism. Nehru, even before he had arrived in Europe in 1933-34, was already a committed anti-fascist. He couldn't see himself compromising or yielding to any kind of surrender of liberties and democratic principles. And he saw in socialism, which believed that the crisis, socialist leaders believed that the crisis that Europe was facing was in fact the last phase of a crisis in capitalism. Capitalism was tottering to its collapse, and a new phase of history was about to emerge. It had already, glimmerings of that emergence were already visible in the Soviet Union. Through centralized planning, etc., etc. And Nehru firmly felt himself firmly committed to this idea of socialism. And when after Kamala's death, he returns to India and is made the president a second time around in 1936, he announces in the Lucknow Congress. It's very interesting that in the Lucknow Congress, he begins his presidential address with the word comrades. He doesn't use the traditional form of address to the congressman. If I'm not mistaken, this is the first and the only time that any Congress leader has addressed a body of congressmen with this word comrades. And here in that speech, which I think is an epoch-making speech, Nehru argues that a political independence that does not have within it economic equality is a vacuous independence. And the only way India can go anywhere near achieving economic equality is through socialism. And he urges congressmen to make socialism a part of the agenda of the Congress. This does not win him very many friends within the Congress leadership, particularly what came to be called the old guard, and that included Gandhi. But Nehru remained firmly committed to the idea of socialism. He was convinced that only through socialism could economic equality be achieved. As a continuation of these convictions that were going stronger in Nehru's mind and ideology, he became an advocate of industrialization and modern science and technology. He was conscious, very deeply conscious, as was Gandhi indeed, that these ideas of Nehru were contrary to most of Gandhi's fundamental tenets, as Gandhi had explicated them in Hind Swaraj. This is also a very important point to underline, that the two of them differed fundamentally on their vision about India's future. When India becomes independent, what kind of India would it be? Nehru believed it should be an industrialized India, an India based on science and technology. And Gandhi, of course, as is well known, believed that the new India would have to be built from the villages. They disagreed openly about this. Nehru wrote about his disagreements in his autobiography very clearly and in the strongest possible terms. Gandhi knew about it. He differed with Nehru, but there was never any rancor between the two of them. The articulation of these differences did not in any way diminish their personal respect and affection and for each other. I think this is an important point to underline, because so much of our lives today and in the past as well has been informed by a kind of shrillness and abuse whenever there has been dissent and disagreement. When he became Prime Minister of independent India, Nehru carried forward these ideas, these commitments that had already taken shape in his mind. He was convinced that these were the essential components in the making of a new and independent nation. But over and above all these was his commitment to build a democratic polity and society in India. He saw this commitment as his most important and initial responsibility. It was to that end that, contrary to all expectations and the surprise of many, particularly in the Western world, he was an unswerving advocate of universal adult franchise. The first general elections of the Republic of India were held under these conditions. All adult Indians had an equal voting in the building of India's future. Jawaharlal Nehru's commitment to democracy was evident in the importance he gave to Parliament and its procedures. He led by example by being present in Parliament when Parliament was in session, and he was present in the capital. He took steps to establish the rule of law and the cabinet form of government, in which the Prime Minister was primus inter pares. He anchored democracy in India on religious tolerance and secularism, and ensured that India belonged to all Indians, irrespective of their religious beliefs. As an advocate of socialism and as a Prime Minister of a country in which the incidence of illiteracy and poverty was high, Nehru believed that the state should be an active player in the society and in the economy. Despite widespread hostility and controversy, he initiated reforms to change some aspects of the Orthodox Hindu society. He was conscious that the Orthodox Muslim society was also in need of reform, but did not venture into a reform program of the Muslim community because, in his view, there did not exist sufficient enlightenment and impetus for reform within Muslim society. While the state attempted to reform the society, it was in the economic sphere that Nehru made the state a key actor by, one, introducing planning where the state became the principal allocator of economic resources; two, making the state the owner of important manufacturing units to control the commanding heights of the economy; and three, placing the state in charge of all major projects relating to the building of infrastructure. He believed that controlling the economy was the avenue to usher in socialism. He was conscious that India's path to economic self-sufficiency and that modernity would not be viable without Indian technocrats and managers. To this end, the state under Jawaharlal Nehru invested in building institutes of technology and management that were modeled on international norms and standards. He had, as a young man, from the time he was a young man, believed that what was happening in India was inseparable from what was happening in the world. And he tried to make this possible, open up this as well during the course of his prime ministership. And this fashioned his attitude towards Indian foreign policy. It was here, perhaps, and one should make no bones about this, that he was the least successful. He had the misfortune of witnessing his foreign policy getting caught in the aggravating ambience of the Cold War. It was Jawaharlal's contention that as a fledgling nation, India should steer away from both poles of the covert war. He tried also to convince other Asian nations to do the same. This action propelled him to the position of a spokesman of a new Asia that believed it could build its own future since it had thrown off the shackles of Western dominance. This policy came to be known as the policy of non-alignment. But in the implementation of this policy, Nehru was not often very consistent. For example, in July, when Nasser, a very close admirer and associate of Nehru, nationalized the company that managed the Suez Canal, and following that, when Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to gain control over the canal, Nehru criticized the invasion in very strong terms. But when, within a few weeks later, the Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary to brutally suppress an anti-Soviet uprising, Nehru was unwilling to condemn or criticize it. Indeed, during the vote in the United Nations, India abstained. Hence, the rather telling statement, I think it was made by The Guardian, that Nehru sat on the fence with his legs dangling prominently on one side. Jawaharlal professed to be a pacifist in world affairs, but did not hesitate to use the armed forces to annex Goa into the Indian Union. He left Kashmir and issues with Pakistan festering and could not escape the responsibility of the humiliation in the hands of the Chinese in 1962. In many ways, Nehru was an idealist, but he was not free from contradictions. I have already pointed to some of the contradictions, but most importantly, he saw himself as a Marxist, but he rejected regimentation. He saw himself as a socialist, but he was fully committed to civil liberties. He saw himself as a radical, but accepted non-violence. He was an international statesman, but he was totally involved and immersed in India. And he was a leader, an undisputed leader of India who believed in carrying his people with him, even if it slowed down the pace of progress. Jawaharlal was in no way a religious man, and he saw his attitude to religion to be somewhat out of tune with the traditions of India. But he believed in some kind of an ethical approach to life. I quote that, some kind of an ethical approach to life. But he was not sure in his mind what this meant. And in May 1933, articulating his dilemma, he wrote to Gandhi, "Religion is not familiar ground for me," I'm quoting. "And as I have grown older, I have definitely drifted away from it. I have something else in its place, something older than just intellect and reason, which gives me strength and hope. Apart from the indefinable and indefinite urge, which may have just a tinge of religion in it and yet is wholly different from it, I have grown entirely to rely on the workings of the mind. Perhaps they are weak supports to rely upon, but search as I will, I can see no better ones. Nehru was a political leader by force of circumstances, a mass political leader who relied on the workings of the mind. His making of India could not but be an intellectual project. He thus left behind a legacy of intellectual, historical, and political understanding, which was grounded in empathy and religious tolerance and a deep humanity. In 1942, during the course of his longest spell in prison, he quoted in his diary, a statement from Gautam Buddha. The statement ran like this: I would enter a blazing fire, but I would not enter my home with my goal unattained. Unquote. Nehru added that as he read that line, quote, a thrill passed through me, almost an electric shock. In his twilight years, Nehru was profoundly conscious of how much he had left undone. Thus, on his desk, he copied out and kept on his table those moving lines of Robert Frost. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Once asked what his legacy to India would be, Jawaharlal had replied, quote, hopefully, it is 400 million people capable of governing themselves, unquote. India has miles to go to complete Jawaharlal Nehru's unfinished legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mukherjee. That was a very comprehensive and multifaceted coverage of Jawaharlal Nehru. Like you said, what stands out, he was an undisputed leader who struck several blows for entrenching democracy in India, including for being first among the developing countries to have universal adult franchise. So, thank you very much, sir. And we now move on to the question and answer session. I'm sorry, in between, as Dr. Ananya was completing, I had a short disruption with my Wi-Fi. I'm happy that my friends kept it going. But now we have some questions. As I can see, there are two questions. Firstly, on the foreign policy, the Nehruvian foreign policy. The first comment says that the claim that NAM, that is the non-aligned movement, was significant or beneficial is without basis. Till date, I failed to see it serving any utility beyond photo ops. The second question on foreign policy is that it is a narrow-minded, Euro-Western oriented. Engagement with the East was lacking in any strategic wisdom. I would like you to respond, Dr. Ananya first, and then Professor Mukherjee maybe on this question, please.
See, I think that an appreciation of non-alignment, of third world solidarity, of Pan-Africanism, and of you know, the first impetus of decolonization as a wave that sweeps through the world. I mean, in order to appreciate all of this and to appreciate the role that Nehru tried to carve out for India in all of these global processes, you have to wind back to the context of the end of World War II, the defeat of the totalitarian and fascist regimes, the sort of polarization of the world into the pro American and the pro Soviet blocs, and then look at what is happening with the rise of this new bipolar world and the decline of the earlier European empires, the largest of which was the British Empire, and the largest part of that was, of course, India, which was emerging, India and Pakistan together, which were emerging into democratic freedom. So, I mean, maybe to us today, this idea of non alignment doesn't make any sense, but that's because we're in a world which is post Soviet, which is not bipolar in quite the same way. We're also looking at a very different phase of American power, which has declined in certain ways, which has receded in certain ways, which is in crisis in certain ways. So, today, if we talk about non-alignment, it doesn't make any sense. But if we look carefully at what's happening in the world in the 1940s and 1950s, even in the 1960s, then it becomes clear that it was tough for India to navigate that period when it was neither going with communism nor going with capitalism, but trying to carve out some kind of a socialist, welfarist, and yet democratic and sort of Republican alternative. And that it had a tremendous impact. This is something that I've slowly come to appreciate. I must confess, autobiographically, because of the place where I work, Center for the Study of Developing Societies, and in the early years of the center's life, which began in the early 60s and is still continuing, um, um, the the importance of the connections between Indian and South Asian and African and Southeast Asian and Latin American intellectuals and intellectuals from the Arab world and the Middle East. I mean, this is something which was very real. And there was a constant exchange of ideas. People traveled back and forth. They wrote to each other. They wrote for each other. They read one another. And in this sense, India did play a pioneering role because it was one of the first to decolonize, and many countries followed thereafter. So you have to go back to moments like Bandung. You have to go back to the kind of solidarity that Nehru, Nasser, and Tito tried to build. And you have to think of the pressure of the entire Soviet bloc, which consisted not only of Eastern Europe but of all the kind of Central Asian republics. And to say nothing of Chinese communism. And under that is India, trying to be a beacon of democracy. So I don't think you can, discount the importance of these contestations and these positions in their historical context for their moment. The world has changed, and India has to change with it. But there has to be an awareness of where we are coming from before we rush into new configurations of power, of solidarity, and of geopolitical alignment or realignment. Um, I think that answers the foreign policy question, perhaps. Um,
Yeah, it does. It does.
yeah.
Would
Sorry. Yeah, there wasn't
would
another question yet, I think. Yeah.
yeah, would Professor Mukherjee like to add to this?
Yeah, I think it's ironic that something that was precisely trying to break away from the domination of Europe is being seen as uh, being Eurocentric. It's precisely because Nehru didn't want to be Eurocentric that he was trying to build up an Afro-Asian solidarity. And this is actually what also informs, in the process, tragically, his attempts to form a solidarity with China. He sees India and China working together to build an Asian solidarity that is that will challenge and overcome perhaps the dominance of the West and Europe in particular. And I would like to emphasize again, as Ananya has done, the context of non-alignment, the context of the Cold War. I mean, what were the choices in front of Nehru? He was a Democrat. He was trying to build up a democratic republic, an infant democratic republic in India. And the two ideological blocks were in different ways actually propping up totalitarianism, one within the Soviet Union itself and in other countries of Eastern Europe. And as we know today very clearly, America was doing the same, playing the same role in Latin America, propping up dictators, and in parts of Southeast Asia as well. So what were the choices in front of Nehru? He couldn't have gone to one of the two blocks. So he tried to chart out a path for himself. And the world has, of course, changed. But this is where how Indian foreign policy began. It is out of this context that Nehru's foreign policy emerged. I think we need to emphasize and underline that before we dismiss non-alignment in the way that the questioner has done. He or she is, of course, entitled to her own view and dismiss Nehru's foreign policy. But I would also urge the consideration of the context in which in Nehru's foreign policy evolved.
Yes.
I just wanted to, sorry, Madhu, I just want to add one thing. I mean, foreign policy and domestic policy are closely linked. And I think in a world full of migration and border crossings and refugee flows and climate crisis and globalization, and a kind of necessity to manage resources globally, how you treat your own population and is connected to how you then deal with the world. So in a certain perspective, you could say foreign policy doesn't just boil down to buying and selling weapons and making strategic alliances which are militarily based, and taking on enmities in your neighborhood and so on. Foreign policy involves long conversations over long periods of time with a proper knowledge of one's own history and the history of other nations, and a sense. Essentially, I think what Professor Mukherjee said was so important, that it has to be grounded in two values. One is empathy and the other is solidarity. You cannot have a successful foreign policy without both these qualities, and I think Nehru had those. Whatever his strategic difficulties, whatever his difficulties in assessing the sincerity of others, whatever his weakness in terms of India's sort of military strength at that time, at least the desire to build a better world and a more democratic world. That was not negotiable, and that is something from which we have fallen away, it seems to me, over time. Looking at foreign policy in much more transactional ways, as merely the flow of goods, the flow of weapons, the flow of currencies, and not what it really should be, which is the flow of humans and of ideas. So that is something that I think we should keep in mind when we start to sort of thoughtlessly criticize earlier attempts at building solidarity, like non-alignment.
Thank you, Dr. Ania. Professor Mukherjee, yes, the foreign policy, Nehruvian foreign policy was laden with idealism and with the sense of giving voice to the world, which was just liberating itself from the colonial yoke. So that's the context. I have to club two more questions. One is that it's from an admirer. I think, what do you think made Nehru the leader he was, and how can we create an environment for leaders of such nature to develop in the current India? And clubbing with that, I'm asking this question about, it was actually posed to Dr. Ananya, which is what is the most relevant from his political ethos right now? Would you like to respond? First, Dr. Ananya, then Professor Mukherjee, please.
See, as somebody who's an academic, a scholar, a researcher, a teacher, and this description fits both of us, Rudrangshu and myself. I have always benefited from and inhabited, the space of education and research in this country. So, to me, what is so admirable about Nehru is the way in which he dealt with, the setting up of institutions of higher learning, of fundamental research, whether in the sciences or in the social sciences. That he valued and respected expertise of all kinds. He brought the best people back to India from wherever they were studying, wherever they were living, and he gave them the mandate to create institutions, whether it was laboratories, whether it was libraries, whether it was museums, whether it was archives, whether it was the IITs or the IIMs, or the TIFRs, or any of these kind of basic kind of it's like planting a field. It's like planting a crop in a field where you're thinking about the harvest of knowledge, of leadership, of vision, and of prosperity that you will create for generations down the line, right? So that is the ethos that I think has endured and has actually created several generations since partition and independence of Indians who are whether they are doctors or they are scientists or they're engineers or they're social scientists or they're scholars of literature or language or whatever it is that they are, right? That they are really taking very seriously both their own vocation as educating a largely illiterate, backward, poor population, which is rising out of the ashes of colonialism, right? A society which is gripped by various kinds of internal problems like caste, and the inequalities produced by caste, where people face a great deal of violence and deprivation. So for to create an educated class and to create a set of institutions where people take seriously their vocation as a kind of form of public pedagogy, right, which also then feeds into a larger kind of national purpose of self-reliance, and of true sovereignty, whether it is of ideas or if it's in more material terms. That was, I think, his greatest contribution, right? That you can't just sort of import everything. You can't just outsource everything. You can't just sell everything, right? You have to build, you have to invest, you have to commit, you have to have a long term vision, that the next generation has to be better off than the previous one. And that's not just in terms of how much money they have to spend, but really in their perspective has to be broader, wider, and deeper. And I think Nehru should be seen really much more than a leader. He should be seen as a kind of educator of India. I really liked what Rudrangshu said about him anchoring this democracy, and the anchor is created through strong institutions which are outside of mainstream politics. Whether it is the judicial system, whether it is the educational system, whether it is freedom of the press and the media, these are the pillars actually of a democracy. And I think he engaged with the best and the brightest in all these fields. He was able to talk to them as an equal because he was also well read and well informed and opinionated, and he was ambitious for India, and that is something which you really need to imbue that spirit into each person who is involved in the betterment of the collective life of this nation. And that's what we get from Nehru. So I think, in terms of creating a class of leaders like that, I think that capacity to think for the nation, or for the community, or for humanity as such, that exists among young people. After all, we are all products of a Nehruvian education system, even up till now. But whether that will continue for future generations, I have my doubts, because if you look at the state of our institutions, um, you know, it's as though we were literally setting fire to a standing crop, rather than thinking about harvesting more and more in the future by tending our fields with care. That is what is missing in today's ethos, and that is, to my mind, what Nehru gave us. His greatest gift, really, was this drive towards educating and empowering Indians through access to sort of the cutting edge of every kind of human thought and endeavor that was available in his time.
If I could just add to that, and it's a small addition,
Yes,
I endorse everything Ananya said. Just I want to add that Nehru, apart from doing all the things that Ananya has presented to us, he also created a space, a very large space, in which individuals of various kinds could live with difference, all kinds of ideological differences, as well as space for dissent. And he himself led from the front, as I said, because he had very strong critics, even in parliament. And some of them were very powerful orators, Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, Hiren Mukherjee, J.B. Kripalani, and people like that. And from all accounts that we have, he listened to them with rapt attention when they spoke in parliament. So I think that's a very important point, that he did not try in any way to suppress voices of difference and voices of dissent. He believed that these were necessary if democracy had to thrive, had to nurture, and had to develop in India.
Professor Mukherjee, there's a question related to his not suppressing voices. That is that there is a question which reads like this: on the topic of freedom of speech, almost 100, the question mark, dozens of books that he ideologically was opposed to were banned under him. Would you like to respond?
I'd like to know which books are these.
Yeah, that's what I thought. The questioner did not mention the books. I would.
And hundreds.
So we'll move on. So maybe if he posts the books, then we'll respond to it. For the time being, we'll move on. There is this question on what was his take on caste? Was it aligned to Ambedkar or a more softer path like that of Gandhi? Professor Mukherjee, would you like to respond?
I don't know if Gandhi's path was softer. Gandhi was seriously and deeply engaged in the removal of untouchability. I would say as deeply as Ambedkar was. Their ways to approach the removal of untouchability might have been different, but that they were committed to the removal of untouchability and the caste system, I think that goes without saying. So Nehru with Ambedkar, as Ananya said, was a crafter of the constitution, and how caste would be dealt with was actually set out in the constitution itself. And Ambedkar actually agreed with that and was the proponent of that policy. And so on that, Nehru and Ambedkar were actually on the same page. Maybe, but Ananya is much better placed because she has done far more work on Ambedkar than I have to respond to this question.
Yes, Dr. Ananya, please.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Rudrangshu just said, that, there's no question that Gandhi was soft on caste. Look, I think as far as Nehru is concerned, and this is a common trait actually between Ambedkar and Nehru, is, their commitment to equal citizenship, to fundamental rights, to universal adult franchise, to gender equality, to religious toleration, and to minority protection. I think, they were well matched and equally committed to all of these things together. And Nehru. I mean, it's interesting that Rudrangshu brought up the autobiography, because I was also just reading it over the last few days carefully, and so much emerges from the candor of the self-awareness, and the slightly self-critical kind of angle at which Nehru comes at his own, his own family, his own class position, his own, social background, his own kind of wealth, his own privilege, his own elite status, and then descends, as it were, from that ivory tower of Harrow and Trinity College, Cambridge, and enters into India. And here, we have to think about Ambedkar and Gandhi also as travelers, who are coming from different spaces and then entering very consciously, with great purpose into this voyage of discovery, where they move among the common people, right? And they start to see everything afresh, whether it is caste, whether it is gender, whether it is religion, whether it is questions of any kind of the cornerstone, you could say, of our cultural and social life. They start to reconsider once they move among the people, and this strong kind of desire to connect with people, right, and to be aware of people's needs, is something that I think all of these leaders of that generation had in common, which is quite different from the kind of top-down politics that we have today, or the politics of disengagement and alienation that exists today, where no leadership has a strong sense of what people need, what people want, what people are afraid of, how people are vulnerable, right? And when you read Nehru on farmers, on peasants, when you read him in The Discovery of India, where he describes his first election campaigns in the late 1930s, and his sort of revelation as regards Bharat Mata, right? That who is she? How does he how does he literally look at the people who are standing in their hundreds and thousands at his election rallies? It's a question of connection, and that is something that is the enemy of caste, right? Which is about exclusion, which is about differentiation, which is about distancing oneself from all those who are different, and exercising power over them, right? Dominating them, trying to secure self-interest at the cost of others. I don't think Nehru, Gandhi, Ambedkar, any of them could be accused of being soft on caste. I think they were all deeply committed to human equality and human dignity, and to respect across gender, across caste, across religion. And that is something which has practically vanished, I think, from our public life today, from our political life today. It's enshrined in the Constitution, but it is not evident in the way we treat one another in this country today.
I think we already breached the time limit we set for ourselves, but with the permission of the speakers, we could take a couple of more questions. I think, firstly, I would like to say there are a lot of comments which have come in the form of appreciation for both Dr. Ananya and Professor Rudrangshu. So I will just end it with two more questions. The first one relates to Kashmir. That is, can Dr. Ananya shed some light on the detention of Sheikh Abdullah and the misunderstandings between Nehru and Mr. Abdullah? I would like to add, there is also this accusation that Nehru needlessly agreed to the British suggestion to refer it to the United Nations, which evidently some later research has shown that the British used it for a diplomatic exercise to the disadvantage of India. Maybe you'd like to respond to that, then we'll go to the last question.
It's interesting. As I told you, I was just rereading the autobiography, and it begins with Kashmir. I think the very first chapter is called something like A Descent from Kashmir. And Nehru talks about his earliest ancestor, one Raj Kaul, who comes down in the early 18th century from the mountains into the plains. The last of the sort of Mughals after Aurangzeb, the late Mughals, when the Mughals are in decline, then his ancestors, who are scholars of Sanskrit and Persian from the Kashmiri Pandit community, they are kind of brought into this, gradually weakening court. Then they're allotted some land next to a canal, a Neher, which is how they come to have the name Nehru. And so for a while they are called Kauls, then they are called Kaul Nehrus, and then they're just called Nehrus by the time you get to, the generation of Nehru's father and grandfather. And there's clearly, it's clearly something, Kashmir is something that he feels to be an inalienable part of his own personal story, his identity, his being in the world. It's interesting, a few chapters down, then he goes away abroad to study. He grows up in this kind of solitary way when, he doesn't really have any siblings. His sisters are much younger than him. And his father's very busy in politics. Then he gets sent off to study in England. Then he's kind of wandering around in England and Europe for a while. Then he comes back to India. Then he gets married. And he describes, his wedding. And then he says, he doesn't even describe it. He says, we got married and then we went to Kashmir for a few months. And I left my family in the valley and I went off, into the mountains with a cousin. And he describes how he almost died because he tried to walk over a huge sort of glacier, for many, many miles at a great altitude to the cave of Amarnath. And he keeps saying that we fell into crevasses, we were caught in this kind of blizzard, we lost our way, it was much further, much colder, much higher than we thought, and yet we kept going, and I just wanted to get to that cave, and in the end he never got to the cave, but he almost died doing this. So his whole chapter on his wedding and marriage is actually his memory of trying to sort of navigate this landscape of Kashmir, right? Which again, I feel, if you read in a kind of psychobiographical way, there's something very, very deep there that is that he's trying to convey about his sense of belonging, his sense of place, and his sense of identification. Now, this falls apart after independence. He starts out being very close to Sheikh Abdullah. They are both social reformers, they are both radicals, they are both looking at dismantling a monarchical state. They are trying to give land back to the people. They're trying to reform an economy that is that has extorted the Kashmiri people. But as Nehru is trying to do for India as a whole, Sheikh is trying to do for Kashmir, right? They're trying to liberate on bigger and smaller scales the regions for which they are responsible, and the peoples for whom they are responsible, of whom they are the leaders, not just from colonialism, but also from a certain kind of feudalism, from a certain kind of non-democratic rule and political economy. Now, when it comes to sharing power, when it comes to letting Abdullah do his thing, right, and letting the Kashmiri people figure out, and at that time the question is not so much about religious identity, it's not about Muslims and Hindus or India and Pakistan so much, it's really about the poverty of the people as opposed to the wealth of the Maharajas, and how to fix that basic problem. When it comes to allowing that process to find its own way in Kashmir, Nehru is not able to relinquish control. And in a sense, there is a betrayal of the friendship between Abdullah and Nehru as people, but there is also a sort of forgetting, I think, of Nehru's own deep attachment, which is very personal to this part of the country, which is where he and his family come from, and they hand over to they install a sort of puppet regime, and from the very get-go there is a sense of bad faith, right? And this has only been exacerbated over time. So of course that proverbial return to the UN for a plebiscite, which never happens, the wars with Pakistan throughout the course of the 20th century, and today the state of complete sort of abdication of any kind of democratic mandate, any kind of responsibility towards the valley and its people of all communities. So I think Nehru had some sort of a complex relationship with this place, but the mistake that he made in alienating Sheikh Abdullah, in incarcerating him, in preventing him from rolling out the full plethora of reforms that he might have gone on to institute, that is something that Kashmiris are paying for even today. And the Indian state has not managed to rectify and self-correct. In fact, it has only become more extreme in the way that it tries to handle the political demands of this region. Of course, also on account of an international and a global atmosphere that is more charged, that is more radicalized, that is more violent, that is more highly militarized, and so on. But I don't think that Nehru can be let off the hook for what getting Kashmir off to a very bad start. I would say that would be my critique. And although I'm an admirer of Nehru on almost every count, in this one way, I feel unable to really understand why he did what he did. What could possibly explain that? Mishandling of the Kashmir situation.
Would Professor Mukherjee like to add to this?
No, I would like to emphasize this last point Ananya made, which I think is very important, to be appreciative of what Nehru did and to be appreciative of the legacy that he has left behind. It is not necessary to be blind to his faults and his failures and shortcomings. It's part of his legacy. Nobody sees Nehru as being infallible and perfect, but we have to see him in the round, and that's what we have to do as scholars, intellectuals, and historians or social scientists. That's the space actually Nehru created for us, as Ananya said in response to a previous question.
Thank you, sir. In fact, if I may add a small piece of information, as I was reading, there was this book of on the legacy of Nehru, where Nancy Lobo and Jayasham say that it was Nehru who lobbied with Cyril Radcliffe to include Gurudaspur and Pathankot tehsils in India. This kind of provided the convenience of land access to the Kashmir Valley. So this is just an add-on. So we will take on, there are a few more questions, but a lot of appreciation and thanks expressed to both the professors. The last, I would sum up two questions into this thing. First one is on why is it that the right wing wishes to disavow and repudiate Nehru in the present day, but why is he also seen as problematic by the left and the center? This is also related to another question: what has happened to the economic policy of Nehru? Why is it gone to all turned into everything into privatization now? So basically, the Nehruvian economic policy, which was then onto a mixed economy, has now moved on to one where the state has been rolled back and the space has been vacated for the private enterprise. And the second thing is, why is it there is criticism from the right, when and the left? Professor Mukherjee, please.
So again, the context is important. Times changed in the 90s and 1980s and 1990s, particularly with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of a unipolar world. And that is one of the factors that influences liberalization and economic reforms under Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh. So we cannot see the legacy of Nehru as something that is frozen in time. That's one. And the second is why the right opposes Nehru. Only the right can tell us. I cannot speak for them. The left has always been ambiguous towards Nehru. It is only very recently that when it's under severe pressure that it is recognizing how some of Nehru's values are worth cherishing and advocating. This is a very late wisdom on the part of the left.
Dr. Ananya, please.
See, I think there's a global critique to be made here. And the critique is essentially a Gandhian critique, which is to say, there were many things that Nehru, many decisions he made and many choices that he made of which path India was to take. And again, in his time, those seemed like the more progressive choices in favor of a certain kind of scientific, industrial, technological growth, in favor of a certain kind of developmentalism, in favor of a certain kind of, approach to poverty alleviation, backwardness, etc., which was essentially reliant on, exploitative technologies, let's just say, right? And we would not have arrived, and which kind of facilitated the way for the neoliberal turn at the beginning of the 90s, when India entered into, through the Congress party, mind you, not through the left or through the right, but really through the Congress party. It entered into this process of globalization, market reforms, liberalization, etc., right? So that, in a sense, we would not have arrived at this moment of environmental and crisis, and of ecological collapse, and of climate crisis, if the whole world had not actually taken that kind of a path, which Gandhi had warned against as early as in 1909, when he wrote Hind Swaraj, right? So this is not Nehru's sort of peculiar kind of headache. I mean, he genuinely believed in a certain kind of progress, and he genuinely believed in a certain kind of idea of growth and development and so on, right? The question is, now that you can see that India is the most polluted country in the world, you can see that you're going to face a complete end to your water resources within the next 30 years. You can see the kind of inequity and inequality that the widening income gaps that this kind of neoliberal reform, so to speak, has produced. You can see the crisis of Indian cities and urbanization. You can see what is happening in the farming sector, and in the rural sector, in the agricultural sector, right? To people, where there's sort of an epidemic of mass suicide, even if you discount the protests. I think that to not now, for the left and the right and the center and everybody to not rethink their basic economic framework is madness. It's suicidal, and we will arrive at an absolutely unsustainable point much sooner than we think, especially on the subcontinent, where we have the most people and limited resources, and social structures and political problems that prevent equal access, equal opportunity, and a just distribution of our resources. So I think that the question of economic policy, to which the Nehruvian discussion is actually reduced, right, repeatedly, and to which the right-left discussion is also reduced, right? It's really reduced to two things. One is the question of religious tolerance, and the other is the question of economic policy, right? And on both those fronts, right, I think what is valuable is the Nehruvian impulse, right? If not the actualization, if not the realization, but at least the desire for greater justice, for greater equality, right? For the betterment of the greater number of people, right? And the willingness to explore the road less taken, in order to arrive at So I think maybe India's position on at the climate talks, for example, very recently, might have been different if we were following a Nehruvian way of thinking about climate justice, right? Similarly, any kind of sort of short-sighted solution to problems of equity and access, the way in which we respond to social movements, the way in which we respond to dissent and to protest from any sector of society, be it women, be it Dalits, be it farmers, be it backward castes, as be it people in contentious borderlands, be it tribals, any call for justice, the state's response cannot be primarily antagonistic and hostile, right? The first impulse has to be, these are voices we need to hear because these are the people of this country. And I think that, even while trying to manage this crazy diversity, that basic impulse, I would trust Nehru had. He made many mistakes, and he was quite unjust in many theaters. Historians of India's wars, of Nehru's wars, can tell you more about that. But at the same time, the basic position of the state has to be for the people and not against the people. That is the basis of a democracy, and that is something that we are losing sight of, left or right or center or in any other political end of the spectrum.
Thank you, Dr. Ananya. And I guess one session is not enough for discussing Nehru, his legacy, his life, and the questions about him, and the discussion would be. But it's been a wonderful session. I would now, unfortunately, for want of time, there are questions and there are compliments, there are questions, and then which are still pending, which probably we can see how we can pass them on and respond to them in some other manner. But for the time being, we will end this question and answer session. I'll now request Gagarin to propose the vote of thanks for this wonderful session we've had so far.
Thanks a lot, Madhu. In fact, I am feeling as if Dr. Ananya has already told, and even Professor, whatever may be the seeds sown by Jawaharlal Nehru and other founding fathers, grew a crop like these scholars. And in that high crop, I am feeling like a Lilliput. I have to shout at the top of my voice how to thank these people, literally and figuratively. In fact, seeing the unfortunate situation at the moment, I can only quote Dante, who said, I quote, "The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in periods of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality." In fact, this particular thing has brought us to do whatever may be the little squirrel help or effort to prevent the present from becoming hotter than the hellfire. Truth may triumph in the ultimate analysis, but unfortunately, lies have instant power. Invented lies have more power. And the invented lies repeated, endowed with religious sanctimony, has such a greatest power. Certainly, in fact, I have to say, subvert the very God himself. That is what it appears at the moment. And Nehru is the unfortunate victim of this saturnizing statesman in whatever may be the fashion possible. This is what we have seen. That is the reason why we have necessarily to come here. And whether we can stem the rot or not, I can only quote again Baba Saheb Ambedkar, who tells, I quote, "The duty must be performed. Let the efforts be successful or not. Let the work be appreciated or not." Unquote. Accordingly, we, a small group of civil servants, thought that we can be handheld by scholars like you. And certainly, our Lilliputian hands you have ably held, and we came. We thank Dr. Ananya for differentiating visions from myths. Because India, either we have got too many visions, 12 crore years of civilization, 4 yugas of civilization. Either these sort of visions are, I mean, myths, or visions which are only seen in dreams. But what a dreamer, the first founding father, the Prime Minister, has seen, very ably delineated by Dr. Ananya. We are really grateful. Even ever since we have started our program, you helped us. Such an incredible interest you have evinced, and the pains you have taken to clear the fog gathering around our first Prime Minister. Thanks a lot, Ma'am. And so far as our senior professor is concerned, our grateful thanks are always due to Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee. In fact, what I have to say is the childlike curiosity in the issue and the sage-like treatment he has given to it. His advice in the first meeting, you should not stop here, you have to do something else. And he has also told us whom we have to approach also in order to make the issue better unfolded. Thanks a lot, sir, for your not only unfolding, or rather the issue at hand, but also helping us in organizing the future webinars. And Sadiq Ali, the man who is really the technical backbone of us, without him, we should not have sit in our chairs. Thanks a lot, Mr. Sadiq Ali Garu. I don't know, Mr. and Garu can be put together. I don't know. But anyway, thanks a lot for the enormous support you have given. Last but not least, whatever may be the poster we have put in all the groups. In fact, that is the reason why if poster itself is this much elegant, how the webinar would be. So that was the class the Shreya Rao showed in the making, or rather design or development of the poster, clearing all our simple doubts. And not only clearing all our simple doubts, whatever may be the suggestions we have given, even though the most inept, she has incorporated all of them and brought an elegant poster. And whatever may be the response which we have seen is certainly some of the credit has to go to this poster. Thanks a ton, Shreya ji, for this elegant and wonderful poster. And last, this is the large gathering we have not expected. In fact, ma'am has also asked, will anybody participate? But the way in which compliments poured in, and the way in which questions have either arisen, or the people have literally forced themselves to pose questions, because such is the wonderful discussion both the professors have initiated, gone through, and then very wonderfully concluded. So this particular gathering will encourage us to make better webinars in future. Hats off to all the participants. Thanks a lot for professors, for all the other technicians and all. And we'd like to say, in fact, taking a cue from our senior professor Mukherjee sir, the next seminar is not very far. 28th December, we'd like to conduct a seminar on Gandhi and his nationalism, because that is another issue, very, very important, and raising a lot of dust, even though clarity is there or not. So until December 28th, namaste all. Thanks a lot. And Such a wonderful.
Small correction, Gagarin, small correction. It is 26th of December, the last Sunday.
Oh,
And thanks to all the audience who have joined. It's a wonderful. You made the webinar stimulating from your interesting questions. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.